The banquet hall was filled with soft music, polished silverware, and the kind of polite conversation that comes with charity events. Tonight was supposed to be about generosity. A fundraiser for elder care, hosted by my husband's company. Round tables stretched across the room beneath warm chandelier light. Executives, donors, and local reporters filled the seats. At the front, a stage held a podium decorated with white orchids. My husband, Daniel, stood behind it with the confident smile people trusted too easily. He adjusted the microphone. "Before we continue tonight," he said, "I'd like to thank someone very special." His gaze found me immediately. Several guests turned. My stomach tightened, though my face remained calm. "My wife, Claire," he continued warmly. "She's always had a soft heart for family, especially her mother." Polite laughter followed. Daniel leaned slightly closer to the microphone. "Which is why," he added with a playful tone, "I've spent the last year helping manage the care fund she insisted on setting up." A few people clapped. Then he finished the sentence. "Because, as we all know, Claire isn't exactly great with money." The laughter grew louder. I stood slowly, reached into my purse, and placed a thick folder on the nearest table. "Then it's a good thing," I said calmly, "that someone here kept records." The room went quiet. The silence after my words felt heavier than the laughter had been. Daniel blinked once. Only once. It was subtle, but I knew that look. He hadn't expected resistance. The audience shifted in their chairs. Some guests glanced between us like spectators at a tennis match. Daniel forced a smile. "Claire," he said gently, as though calming a child, "you don't need to worry about any of that tonight." His tone made the crowd relax again. He had always been good at that, turning tension into entertainment. But I didn't move. The folder stayed on the table, thick with documents. A few guests leaned forward slightly. Daniel chuckled into the microphone. "My wife can be a little detail-oriented." Laughter again. I opened the folder. Paper edges slid softly against each other. "Detail matters," I replied. Daniel's smile stiffened. Across the room, a young reporter lifted her phone camera slightly. Daniel's voice dropped a fraction. "We'll talk about this later." I met his eyes. "No," I said quietly. Then I lifted the first page. "I think we should talk about it now." The first time I realized something was wrong was 11 months earlier. My mother had just moved into assisted living. The building smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic. Soft music played in the hallway as nurses walked past with gentle smiles. My mother sat by the window of her small room, wrapped in a pale blue cardigan. "Daniel handles everything so well," she said proudly. I nodded. Daniel had insisted on managing her care fund. "It'll make things easier for you," he'd told me. "You're already busy with work." At the time, I believed him. Each month, I transferred money into the account we created for her care. The cost was high, but my mother deserved comfort. One afternoon during a visit, the receptionist stopped me. "Mrs. Carter?" "Yes." "There's a small issue with your mother's account." A strange chill moved through my chest. "What kind of issue?" She hesitated. "Some payments haven't been received." I frowned. "That's impossible." She turned her monitor slightly. Rows of missing deposits filled the screen, and every payment that should have been there was gone. I didn't confront Daniel that night. That's the mistake most people make. They react too quickly. Emotion clouds strategy. Instead, I went home, made tea, and opened my laptop. My profession had trained me for moments like this. For 17 years, I had worked as a financial compliance auditor for healthcare organizations. My job involved tracing money through complicated systems, insurance claims, medical trusts, elder care accounts. Most fraud begins quietly. A missing deposit, a delayed transfer, a temporary adjustment. By midnight, I had logged into the care fund account Daniel managed. What I saw was interesting. Money was leaving the account regularly, but not toward the assisted living facility. Instead, the transfers moved through a small consulting firm, one I didn't recognize. I searched the business registry. The owner's name appeared instantly. Daniel Carter. I leaned back in my chair. So that was the game. But accusations require proof. And proof takes patience. So instead of confronting him, I began documenting everything. Every transfer. Every withdrawal. Every hidden account. Quietly. 3 weeks later, I visited my mother again. She was sitting in the common garden, watching sparrows hop along the stone path. Daniel says the finances are complicated, she told me apologetically. I hope I'm not causing trouble. You're not, I said gently. But the receptionist had already confirmed the truth. The facility was receiving partial payments. Just enough to avoid immediate problems. Just enough to delay suspicion. Classic siphoning. Back home, I opened a new spreadsheet. Column by column, the pattern revealed itself. Daniel had redirected more than half of the care fund into his consulting company. From there, the money moved again. Luxury purchases, travel accounts, investment deposits. The total climbed slowly. 30,000, 50,000, 70,000. By the time I finished, the number sat quietly on the screen. $142,800. All taken from money meant for my mother's care. I printed every transaction, placed them in a folder, and waited, because patience turns evidence into power. And tonight, under the warm lights of this charity banquet, the records were finally about to be opened. If you want, I'll continue with part 2, chapters 6 to 10, where the story becomes much more intense. The charity event confrontation escalates. A lawyer in the audience asks one devastating question. Daniel's financial control starts collapsing. The poetic irony weapon appears. The first crack in his public reputation begins. Just say, continue. Continue. Below is part 2, chapters 6 to 10, continuing the story while maintaining the first-person voice, calm protagonist, realistic financial details, and escalating tension. The paper felt heavier than it should have when I held it up. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, curiosity replacing the polite amusement from earlier. Conversations across the ballroom slowly died away. Daniel still stood at the podium, his smile thinning at the edges. Claire, he said carefully, this really isn't the right moment. I didn't raise my voice. Actually, I replied, it's the perfect one. A ripple moved through the crowd. I turned the page so the nearest tables could see the printed transactions. 11 months ago, I said calmly, I created a care fund for my mother's assisted living expenses. Several guests nodded politely. Daniel tried to laugh again. Yes, and I've been handling that for you. Handling it, I repeated softly. I flipped to the next page. And documenting it. The room quieted further. Across the aisle, a woman with silver hair leaned toward the man beside her. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. I placed the papers on the table and spoke clearly enough for the room. Because according to these records, the account hasn't been paying my mother's care facility. A murmur spread across the ballroom. And the money, I finished, has been going somewhere else. Daniel stepped away from the podium. For the first time that evening, he looked directly at the documents. His voice dropped. We'll talk about this privately. Of course, I said. But the records are public now. A young man at the front table adjusted his glasses and spoke up. Excuse me. Several people turned toward him. He stood, straightening his jacket. My name is Mark Ellison, he said. I'm one of the legal advisors for tonight's foundation. Daniel's posture stiffened. Mark nodded politely in my direction. Mrs. Carter mentioned financial records connected to elder care funds, he continued. That's correct, I said. He gestured gently toward the folder. May I? I slid the documents across the table. Mark read quietly for a moment. His brow furrowed. Then he looked up. Mr. Carter, he said evenly, these transfers appear to route through a consulting firm registered under your name. The room grew still. Daniel opened his mouth. But Mark asked the question first. Did you disclose to your wife that you were redirecting funds meant for her mother's care? Daniel didn't answer immediately. And the silence said everything. I watched Daniel's expression change. Not dramatically. Just enough. Confidence shifting into calculation. He cleared his throat. Those transfers were temporary, he said smoothly. Short-term investments to grow the care fund. A few people nodded uncertainly. Mark glanced back down at the documents. Interesting strategy, he said. Daniel seized the opening.
Yes.
Completely legal. His voice regained strength. Claire tends to worry when she sees numbers without context. A few quiet laughs followed. But Mark hadn't finished reading. He flipped to another page. Then perhaps you can explain this, he said. Daniel frowned. Mark turned the document outward. This account funded 2 international travel reservations, he said calmly. Business class. Another page. And a deposit for a waterfront property. The murmuring grew louder. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. These are normal business expenditures, he said quickly. Mark nodded thoughtfully. Possibly. Then he asked another quiet question. And why were they paid directly from an elder care trust account? The room fell completely silent. Daniel didn't answer. Across the ballroom, someone whispered, "Is this real?" Another voice murmured, "This is supposed to be a charity event." Daniel's face had lost its earlier glow. He turned toward me. "You're misrepresenting things." "I'm presenting records," I said. Nothing more. Nothing less. The distinction mattered. Mark placed the papers back on the table. "Mrs. Carter," he said thoughtfully, "may I ask a question?" "Of course." "Did your husband create the care fund agreement himself?" "Yes." Daniel shifted uneasily. Mark nodded slowly. "That explains the structure." Daniel forced a laugh. "What's that supposed to mean?" Mark folded his hands. "The agreement requires full financial transparency between trustees." Daniel's expression froze. "And," Mark continued calmly, "it includes a clause requiring independent auditing if discrepancies appear." A few guests exchanged looks. I opened the folder again and placed another document on the table. "The audit request," I said quietly. Daniel stared at it. His voice dropped. "You filed that 3 months ago." The tension in the room felt almost physical now. Daniel looked around the ballroom, suddenly aware that dozens of eyes were watching him. Executives, donors, reporters, all silent. Mark adjusted his glasses again. "If an audit confirms misuse of an elder care fund," he explained calmly, "the legal consequences can be significant." Daniel's voice sharpened. "This is ridiculous." But the confidence was gone. I slid the final document across the table. A certified financial report. Daniel stared at the number printed at the bottom. $142,800. "That," I said quietly, "is how much was taken from the care fund." Someone gasped softly. Daniel shook his head. "You're twisting this." I met his gaze. "No." Then I spoke the sentence I had rehearsed for months. "You promised to care for my mother." The room held its breath. "And instead," I continued calmly, "you used her money to build your own." Daniel didn't respond, because at that moment, everyone in the ballroom was already reading the records. If you'd like, I can continue with Part 3, Chapters 11 to 15, where the story escalates further. Daniel's financial access gets frozen, his professional reputation begins collapsing, a moral witness, a colleague of mine, speaks up, his romantic and social circle begins turning against him, and the poetic irony clause he wrote becomes the weapon that destroys him. Just say, continue. Finish all the chapters. To keep the story structured, readable, and consistent with the strict 200 to 220 words per chapter requirement, I will complete the remaining chapters 11 to 25 in this response, so the narrative flows properly from the previous chapters. Below continues the story from chapter 11. The room no longer felt like a fundraiser. It felt like a courtroom. Guests whispered quietly while Daniel stared at the financial report like it had personally betrayed him. "That number is inaccurate," he said finally. Mark didn't respond right away. Instead, he lifted another page from the folder. "These are bank confirmations," he said. "Certified copies." A murmur moved across the room again. Daniel's eyes darted briefly toward the exit doors. I noticed. He always looked for escape when control slipped away. I stayed seated.
"Come."
"This is a misunderstanding," Daniel insisted. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said quietly. "It's a pattern." I slid another document across the table. A list of transfers. Dates, amounts, account numbers, every movement of the money. Daniel stared at the pages. For the first time that night, his confidence cracked. Mark leaned slightly forward. "Mr. Carter," he said calmly, "these transfers violate the trustee agreement you drafted." Daniel blinked. He had forgotten something important. He wrote the rules. And now those same rules were about to apply to him. A man at the table beside us spoke softly. "Isn't misusing a care fund illegal?" Mark answered without hesitation. "If proven, yes." Daniel laughed nervously. "You're all blowing this out of proportion." But no one was laughing anymore. Even the band in the corner had stopped pretending to play. Daniel turned toward me again. "You could have come to me first." "I did," I said. He frowned. "When?" "Every month when I transferred money for my mother." Several guests exchanged looks. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. The reporter near the front lifted her phone higher. "Recording." Mark cleared his throat. "The agreement includes a transparency clause," he reminded the room. Daniel shifted in place. "And a secondary clause requiring restitution if funds are misused." Daniel's voice dropped. "This doesn't have to become public." I met his gaze steadily. "It already is." Because by then, the entire ballroom was watching, and the truth had a way of spreading faster than any speech Daniel could give. My friend Rebecca stood slowly from the back table. She had been quiet all evening. Rebecca worked with me in compliance auditing. Her voice carried clearly across the room. "I reviewed some of those documents with Claire." Daniel looked at her sharply. Rebecca didn't look intimidated. "What we found," she said calmly, "wasn't an accounting error." She lifted a page from the folder. It was systematic redirection. Guests murmured again. Rebecca continued. "Every month the care fund received money." She flipped to another page. "And every month, a portion was transferred to Mr. Carter's consulting firm." Daniel scoffed. "That's normal business structuring." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "Except the consulting firm had no contracts." The room grew quiet again. Rebecca lowered the paper. The money simply stayed there. Daniel's jaw tightened. For years, he had relied on charm and confidence. But those tools don't work well against spreadsheets. Numbers don't care about personality. And neither do auditors. Daniel finally stepped away from the podium completely. His voice was no longer smooth. "You're humiliating me." The irony was almost impressive. I tilted my head slightly. "You started that." The room went silent again. Daniel rubbed his temples. "This is a misunderstanding between spouses." Mark shook his head. "Actually, it's a financial dispute involving a trust." The distinction mattered. Daniel looked around the room. Executives, investors, journalists, all watching. His social armor was cracking. "Claire," he said quietly, "we can fix this." I folded my hands. "How?" He hesitated. "Transfer the money back." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't erase the transaction history." Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly. For the first time since we met 15 years earlier, he looked unsure. And uncertainty spreads quickly, especially when everyone in the room can see it. The reporter stepped closer now. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, "would you like to comment on the care fund transfers?" Daniel glared at her. "No." But the damage was already unfolding. Two executives at the front table whispered together. One of them stood. "Daniel," he said cautiously, "our board will need clarification on this." Daniel's company sponsored the charity event, which meant his reputation wasn't just personal. It was professional. Mark gathered the documents neatly. "If you'd like," he said, "we can conduct a full audit review." Daniel didn't answer. I stood slowly. The ballroom felt quieter than it had all evening. "I didn't come here for revenge," I said calmly. Several people looked surprised. "I came for accountability." Daniel watched me carefully. "And for my mother," I added. Because at the end of the day, that was the only reason any of this mattered. The next morning, the story began spreading. Not through gossip, through records. The reporter published an article about the charity event. It didn't accuse Daniel directly, but it asked questions. And questions are powerful things. Daniel's company board requested a financial review. His consulting firm's accounts were temporarily frozen. Investors grew nervous. I received 3 phone calls from lawyers asking about the audit documentation. Daniel sent me messages. At first, they were polite. Let's talk. Then more urgent. You've gone too far. I didn't respond because the process was already moving. Slowly. Legally. And there was nothing emotional about it. Just procedures. The same procedures Daniel had once believed he controlled. Daniel's public image started changing. Subtle at first. An invitation withdrawn. A speaking event quietly canceled. A business partner requesting clarification. These things happen gradually, but they accumulate. One evening he appeared at my apartment door. He looked tired. You've destroyed everything, he said. I didn't raise my voice. You destroyed it. He laughed bitterly. It was just money. I shook my head. No. Then I spoke the truth he had ignored. It was my mother's security. Daniel didn't answer, because even he understood that difference. The official audit concluded 6 weeks later. The findings were clear. Funds had been redirected without disclosure. Daniel's consulting firm returned the money, with penalties. His position at the company was suspended pending investigation. Friends who once admired him grew distant. No one wanted to defend financial misconduct, especially when documentation existed. Daniel called me once more. I'll fix everything, he said quietly. But by then the legal process had already begun, and processes don't reverse themselves easily. My mother never knew the full story. I didn't think she needed to. Her care fund was restored. Her assisted living facility received the proper payments. When I visited her garden again, she smiled warmly. You look lighter, she said. Maybe I did. Because protecting people who harm you is exhausting. And letting the truth stand on its own is surprisingly peaceful. Daniel's professional life collapsed slowly. Board investigations. Compliance reviews. Legal consultations. Each step chipped away at the reputation he once guarded carefully. Our mutual friends stopped inviting him to gatherings. Investors avoided association. His consulting firm closed quietly within a year. None of it happened overnight. But consequences rarely do. They unfold gradually, just like the choices that create them. Our divorce was finalized the following spring. There were no dramatic arguments. No shouting. Just paperwork. Daniel signed the settlement quietly. His lawyer looked tired. Financial misconduct cases often end that way. Quietly. Rebecca helped me start something new. A small consulting firm specializing in financial transparency for elder care organizations. We helped families track trust accounts, prevent misuse, protect vulnerable relatives. It felt meaningful, almost healing. The business grew quickly. Apparently, many families feared exactly the kind of situation I experienced. Documentation became our strongest tool. Transparency, our guiding principle. Every system we built ensured accountability, because money meant for care should never disappear quietly. Sometimes I still thought about Daniel, not with anger, just curiosity. I wondered if he understood what had truly happened, not the legal consequences, the personal ones. Trust, once broken, rarely rebuilds the same way. On a quiet afternoon, I visited my mother again. She sat in her garden chair watching birds circle above the courtyard. You seem peaceful, she said. I smiled. I am. For years I had believed loyalty meant protecting people at any cost. But loyalty without honesty only creates silence. And silence protects the wrong things. Standing up hadn't been about revenge. It had been about clarity. Because the moment the records were opened, I finally stopped carrying someone else's lies. And in telling the truth, I found a life that was finally my own.